Masters of the Universe Revelation has to probably be one of the most interesting examples of a fanbase turning against the creators. Not since The Last Jedi have I seen this kind of negative reaction to a property, and even in that example, a good majority of people still enjoyed it and defended it. This just seems to have been a total onslaught of review bombings and negative scores by people. It also hasn't helped that many have taken the stance that this show has SJW propaganda in it, and feminism is taking over the He-Man universe. That pretty much just added fuel to the fire. So, when I heard about all this, I knew I had to watch this show. But only the first part was released at the time, and I didn't want to judge something without the full story being complete, since I didn't find that fair at first. So I waited until the next part to be released to watch it and review it. And after 4 months, it finally came. The second part to Masters of the Universe Revelation has been released, and wow. To say the least, this whole thing has been blown out of proportion, and it's hilarious. The amount of reviews I've seen berating this and having the most clickbaity thumbnails is just so funny. But that's where I want to look at this as a whole. I get the show has 2 parts, but they have one continuous story with plot points being picked up and finished in part 2, so I'm going to be reviewing this as one season. And if you have a problem with that,
take it up with the complaints department, right here.
So this show is not as bad as many make it out to be. It's not the best, far from it, but it certainly is not a terrible garbage fire. I'm going to be going into this as best as I can and explaining it in a way that makes sense for what the show is, and to do it in the most objective way possible, since I don't think talking exclusively about the negative stuff helps paint a fair picture of this flawed as hell show, since it still has some good stuff here and there. So, to get started, I'm gonna get this out of the way immediately. That's how I viewed He-Man for the longest time, as a lame joke, since I didn't really know the character outside of the jokes made from him, and sometimes out of context clips from the show. But good God, Revelation somehow made him and the world he's in pretty cool. Like, to get it off the bat, characters, vehicles, and a lot of other things have been translated somewhat well into a modern show like this, where I can definitely say that He-Man and Skeletor actually look cool. The translation of their original cartoon look to modern day is absolutely perfect, and everyone looks great. And I would have to give a lot of credit to the animation and art style, where it somewhat has an anime aesthetic to it, but it's different enough to seem kind of unique. I absolutely loved it, where characters were nicely detailed, with a variety of facial expressions, and they had somewhat of a glow to them. I think the animation shined brightest when it came to the fight scenes. More specifically, the ones involving magic, where there's a ton of moves used in creative ways, from magical portals, shooting projectiles, teleportation, and even regular punches and basic spells like shooting lasers or energy balls are given a weight to them that make them feel so impactful. Additionally, voice acting was pretty good. I don't have a ton to say about this since it was all serviceable and good, although I will say the standout for this is of course Mark Hamill as Skeletor, who does a great job. And he gives the character a bit of a Joker voice, but with it being much more gravelly and not as smooth sounding.
Well then, what are we going to do? Ask her nicely to please stop destroying the universe? Oh my God, we are.
So animation and voice acting wise, this show does a fantastic job, which sadly cannot be said for the story and characters. The show is supposed to be a continuation of the original cartoon, just more gritty and with character drama, which on paper, I think sounded like a good idea, to actually flesh out characters who were created pretty much for the sole purpose of selling toys to children. However, the show doesn't properly use its characters, and with that, all the other aspects of it are affected. Now, to start off, the story here is actually quite interesting. After a surprise attack on Castle Grayskull, Skeletor almost causes the destruction of the universe, attempting to absorb all magic in Eternia. And in an act of self-sacrifice, He-Man, and in turn Skeletor, are killed, with the Sword of Power being broken in two and sent back to heaven and hell in the process. A lot of people were actually pissed off by this move, to kill both the main hero and villain in the first episode, which I can actually see why, since the marketing pegged He-Man as the main focus of the story. I mean, you don't put a side character at the forefront of a poster, and the main character we do follow, Teela, who I'll talk about more later on, isn't very interesting, and this only lasts until the final episode of Part 1, where both He-Man and Skeletor come back, which, funny enough, is where I think the show gets a little better since there's a little more focus on those two. but it's how the story doesn't do anything super interesting and just kinda goes through the motions you'd think it would. Except for the moments when Skeletor came back and almost killed Adam, additionally to him gaining the Sword of Power, as well as Evelyn gaining the Sword of Power. But those just derail the story rather than helping enhance it. Like, I can at least see Skeletor coming back and gaining power as helping continue the story in an interesting way, since that actually makes sense and shakes things up in a natural way. But once Evelyn gains the power, it basically changes who the main threat is literally at the third to last episode of the story. Like, when you start to do what the Rise of Skywalker did by bringing in a new threat that wasn't set up, then you start having a massive consistency issue. But if looking at how the story starts at least, I personally think the idea of both the hero and the villain dying is interesting, since it wouldn't just be a repeat of the entire original show. But there should be definitely a greater focus on Adam, since he was just more interesting. And again, I will get to talking about him later, and maybe instead of creating Skeletor to be the main villain again, they could have focused on that technology cult led by Triclops, and the fight between trying to keep magic alive in Eternia, and the progression of saving the world by moving on to something new.
Rise up, Gamer Boys. It's time to get your Gamer Girl bathwater.
And yes, I know, the next story arc will focus on that, but since Magic in Eternia has returned, it'll just be another sci-fi versus fantasy thing. And I don't know how well my idea of that alternate story would translate, but I think something like that would have been more interesting compared to what we got. Moving on, the characters are undoubtedly the weakest aspect of this show, with both the writing and pacing being the culprits of this, since characters aren't given time to develop and aren't written well enough to be compelling. The pacing firstly was just way too fast, and I didn't mention this when talking about the story, but only having a 10-episode long series involving old characters from the original show and developing them, while interesting new ones and making them good while changing the conflict of the story over and over doesn't work out very well. And I get shows like The Mandalorian only have 7 episodes in its first season, but there were only 2 characters that were made the main focus, and the conflict was clearly set up and not changed at all throughout the whole thing. Characters like Andra are introduced, but have nothing to do, nor have any development given to them. Like, we didn't even get her backstory or why she's working with Teela, which kinda sucks, since Andra comes off as a fun, naive character who has a bit of a childhood innocence to her.
This is Andra. I'm the brains, she's the brawn.
I would have loved to know more about her, since she's shown to be good with tech and has pretty good combat prowess, while also showing that she has fears and isn't a total brave adventurer who laughs in the face of danger, and she becomes the new man-at-arms in the finale. So not being given a lot of character development, she's really just a letdown from being a truly great addition. And there's characters like Beastman who the show makes you think has a role to play and might do something major, but is just tossed aside and killed in the finale with no warning, and again, no development. Like, after he starts questioning Evelyn with the power, he says this.
You asked me, am I man or beast? Today, I am beast.
Which is never really elaborated as to if he was siding with her or was about to attack and betray her. So that was just really awkward. Other old characters as well are usually shown in one episode and then die in the next one. Like Orko, who's introduced in episode 3 and dies in episode 4. And I don't know if that's because we should already know who these characters are since you would have to watch the original, but I would think that a show like this would at least try and help fill you into who these characters are or what they're like without requiring you to watch every episode of a show that ended in 1985. But as I mentioned Orko, he's given a bit of a backstory to him and has a little miniature arc before his heroic sacrifice, which then doesn't really mean much as he basically Gandalfs himself into Orko the White and helps save the day. Almost the same thing can be said for Roboto, who passively mentions how he can't feel fear as a robot. In his heroic sacrifice 2 episodes later, he then says how he now knows fear and shows emotion. Like, stuff like that's not given enough time to be fleshed out or expanded upon, so the characters pretty much die one note. The only 2 side characters I would say that have some development would be Man-at-Arms and Evelyn. Man-at-Arms, not as much. We get to know some of his backstory, which is pretty cool, but again, there's not as much development with him as I would have liked. But Evelyn, on the other case, shows the most growth in the show, even though it kind of feels out of place a little bit. And what I mean by this is I understand how she begins to grow less attached to Skeletor since he's gone, and after being fed up with his abuse she's taken from him, she takes the Sword of Power and basically frees herself of him, which for some reason people think this is a message of a woman doesn't need no man, or a forced feminist message, which makes no sense at all as that. Like, do we forget that villains abuse their lackeys and women all the time? Like, did we forget why Harley Quinn left the Joker? Though, I did think it was a little dumb that she didn't die in the end. Like, as a sort of being released from her miserable life, or as a sort of redemption. Like, a character that literally destroyed heaven and showed that off to the world should not be able to walk away scot-free as if they did nothing wrong. Oh, and also, in the show's finale, she's shown to be mega powerful since she has the power flowing through her, and there's this weird thing going on with like them being in the center of the universe and having all the magic or something, and basically she can do whatever, she's godlike. But once He-Man and Skeletor have the power, they don't have or use these godlike powers for some reason. Like, the power levels shown off in the finale made absolutely no sense. Especially once Teela was able to match up against Evelyn, even with no prior training in magic or anything. And this is the part where I talk about Teela, the main character of the show that everyone seems to hate and use as the main cause for the show being awful. And again, I think that it is an over-exaggeration. She's not an absolutely awful character who I loathe and despise to the core. She's more of a Captain Marvel to me, where she's just so uninteresting, I don't care at all. Like, sure, I do see the feminism vibes from her, but it's nothing I haven't seen before, and at least it doesn't take up too much time during the show, or get in the way most of the time. But it's the writing for her that ruins her character. Like, when the finale is supposed to show her being reborn to become the new sorceress, and she has to give up all attachments in her old life, she straight up uses the power of friendship to basically not do that and still become an all-powerful magic user. Like, I'm sorry, but if the definition of handing something to a character that didn't earn it and have no repercussions for that was a thing, this would be it. She just comes off as selfish, really, leaving her old life behind and the people who cared for her, but she's like all pissed at everyone because Adam's secret and everything, since she was like, "Oh, I didn't know my friend, I was lied to about my friend turning out to be a hero who saved Eternia on multiple occasions, putting his life on the line and to fight the ultimate evil and wasn't some scared prince who didn't take action." Like, what kind of logic is that? She literally just left everyone hanging, not helping once Eternia fell into chaos. A military leader and strategist left her position and life because she was upset because she wasn't invited to the Getting to Know My Friend's Secret Identity Club. Give me a break.
I'm serious!
Blah, 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 me, me, blah, 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 me, me, me.
Thank you.
So if the reason for her leaving everything behind makes no sense, how she resolves the past issues she has with the people that she hasn't seen for a long time is rushed and makes no sense, her arc of taking up the mantle of something greater than anything she's done before and taking up a huge responsibility is not given enough time to be fleshed out and makes no sense, then what's the point of her character? Which, funny enough, that's where I saw Adam as the much more fascinating character. He literally died trying to save Eternia and came back from the dead to be welcomed to a world in chaos and his family being split apart because of his actions. And it was so interesting, and it's what makes it even more disappointing. It's where it's trying to be more serious and adult, but it only does that with violence and swearing, rather than adult themes and concepts. Something like Invincible is adult not just because of the violence in it, but because of the themes and messages within it, and the conflicts the characters go through. The blood and violence is there for show. It's used as a tool of storytelling. It's not just there for the sake of it being cool and edgy or whatever. Oh, and a side note, 5 classic characters died in the span of 3 episodes, and only one of those deaths actually made sense to the story. It borders on the Transformers movie levels of show them off and then kill them off mentality, with the last major thing one of them said being this.
He's back all right. I'd sure like to fist him.
What am I watching? I don't know, but I hate it.
But this video has gone on long enough. I'll wrap it up by saying, Masters of the Universe Revelation is certainly not as bad a dumpster fire as many have made it out to be, and I personally think it was an over-exaggeration, but it certainly isn't a good show. I think that the story was rushed, with characters not given enough time to be fleshed out, and the few who aren't given enough. Although the art style and animation is wonderful, it doesn't help lift up the other major parts of it, and overall it's just disappointing in the end. And so with that, the show gets a 4 out of 10 from me. And that may seem higher than it should be to some, but I've seen things far worse than this. And this is certainly not as bad as some of those other things. I do think there is something here, as unlikely as it is. And I do hope the next story arc will be able to correct the mistakes this part made and actually fix the major issues that have been made. But that's probably just pointless optimism. But it's gonna be a while until then, so we'll just have to deal with what we have and add another chapter to the book of what could have been great.
Yeah.